A man's memory is the only thing that truly belongs to him until someone decides to take that away too. The wedding bells were still echoing across the cobblestone plaza of Culiacan when the black SUVs rolled in like storm clouds. Carlos Mendoza stood in his tailored suit among the celebrating crowd, his trained eyes automatically cataloging exits and threats, a habit carved into his bones during 15 years working both sides of the drug war. He'd come to this celebration as El Chapo's trusted lieutenant, but the DEA badge hidden in his safe back home told a different story, one that could get him skinned alive if discovered. When Los Zetas grabbed Emma Coronel right off the dance floor, Carlos knew this wasn't just another cartel power play. This was personal. This was war. But as he moved to intervene, the world went black, and when consciousness returned 49 hours later, he found himself shivering in a flooded prison cell, accused of crimes he couldn't remember committing. The wedding, the kidnapping, even Emma herself, according to everyone around him, none of it had ever happened. Now Carlos faces the most dangerous question of his double life. Can a man trust his own mind when both his identities are telling him different truths? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The concrete walls of the cell pressed in like a tomb, weeping moisture that pooled ankle deep around Carlos's bare feet. The water was warm, almost body temperature, carrying the metallic tang of rust and something else, something organic that made his stomach clench. He pressed his palm against the wall for support, his legs still unsteady, mind grasping for fragments that slipped away like smoke. Emma's scream, the sound of automatic weapons being chambered, the smell of wedding cake and gunpowder. "You awake now, cabron?" Carlos turned toward the voice. A guard stood beyond the bars, his uniform crisp despite the oppressive humidity that made everything else in this place wilt. The man's badge read Herrera, a name that should have meant something, but Carlos's memory felt like a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. "Where am I?" Carlos's voice came out as a croak. His throat felt raw, as if he'd been screaming. "Federal Detention Center, Guadalajara. You've been our guest for 2 days." Herrera's smile held no warmth. "Though you weren't much for conversation until now. The doctors said the sedatives would wear off eventually." Sedatives? Carlos tried to remember being drugged, being transported, but found only gaps. The last clear memory was the wedding, Emma in her blue dress, the mariachi band, the way the evening light painted the plaza gold, then chaos and then nothing. "I need to make a call." "Sure you do." Herrera jangled his keys like wind chimes. "Everyone in here needs to make a call. But first, you've got visitors." 2 men in expensive suits appeared behind Herrera, their faces hard as carved stone. Carlos recognized the type, federal agents, probably Sedena or Cizan, the kind of men who ask questions with their fists. "Carlos Mendoza," the taller one said, consulting a tablet. "Age 45, born in Tijuana. Former," he paused meaningfully, "security consultant for various business interests in Sinaloa." The description was sanitized but accurate enough. Carlos had spent 3 years building his cover identity as a mid-level enforcer for the Sinaloa cartel, earning El Chapo's trust one bloody job at a time. The irony burned. His real DEA handler, Agent Patricia Vance, had insisted the deep cover assignment would only last 18 months. That was in 2016. "I want to speak with my lawyer," Carlos said. The second agent, shorter but with shark's eyes, stepped closer to the bars. "You're going to want to listen to what we have to say first. 3 federal agents are dead. Agent Martinez, Agent Sandoval, Agent Reyes. Shot execution style with .45 caliber weapon. Your fingerprints on the shell casings." Carlos felt the world tilt. He'd never heard those names before. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Shark Eyes produced a tablet, swiped to a video file. Security footage from the OXXO on Reforma Boulevard. July 23, 11:47 p.m. The screen showed grainy black and white footage of a parking lot. A figure emerged from the shadows. Tall, lean, wearing dark clothing. The image quality was poor, but the build was unmistakably Carlos's. The figure raised a pistol, fired 3 shots into a sedan, then calmly walked away. "I wasn't..." Carlos started, then stopped. July 23rd. That was the night of the wedding. But this footage showed him executing federal agents while Emma was being kidnapped across town. This is fake, doctored. The timestamps check out. The ballistics match. Your fingerprints are on the weapon. The tall agent's voice carried the bored tone of someone reading a grocery list. You executed 3 federal agents, probably because they were getting too close to your operation. Carlos gripped the bars until his knuckles went white. What about Emma Coronel? What about the wedding? The agents exchanged glances. Herrera actually laughed. Emma Coronel is in minimum security at FMC Carswell in Texas, serving her sentence for international drug trafficking conspiracy, Shark Eyes said slowly, as if speaking to a child. She's been there for 8 months. There was no wedding, Mendoza. No kidnapping. Just you, 3 dead federal agents, and enough evidence to put you in a hole for the rest of your life. The cell seemed to spin around Carlos. He remembered Emma's laugh, the weight of her hand in his as he led her to safety, the terror in her eyes when the Zetas burst through the crowd. It had been real, more real than anything he'd experienced in years. I need to contact Agent Patricia Vance, DEA. She'll verify. There is no Agent Patricia Vance in the DEA. The tall agent cut him off. Never has been. You're Carlos Mendoza, cartel enforcer, triple murderer. That's all you've ever been. They turned to leave, their footsteps echoing in the corridor. Herrera lingered for a moment, studying Carlos with something that might have been pity. The mind is a fragile thing, amigo, he said quietly. Sometimes it creates stories to protect us from truths too terrible to face. Sometimes it breaks completely. Alone again, Carlos sank to his knees in the fetid water, staring at his own reflection rippling on the surface. Somewhere in the distance, he could swear he heard wedding bells. The wedding bells faded, leaving only the steady drip of water from the cracked ceiling. Carlos remained on his knees, studying his fractured reflection in the murky pool that had become his world. The face staring back at him looked older than 45. Lines carved deep around the eyes, gray threading through black hair that had grown shaggy during his unexplained captivity. But it was still his face, still the same scar above his left eyebrow from a bar fight in Mexicali when he was 23. Still the same crooked nose, broken twice, once by his father's belt, once by a Tijuana pimp who'd objected to federal interference. Federal. The word tasted bitter now. Had he ever really been DEA? The memories felt solid enough. The academy in Quantico, his first assignment in El Paso, the methodical way Patricia Vance had trained him to think like a criminal while never becoming one. But memories, he was learning, could lie. He closed his eyes and tried to reconstruct the morning of July 23rd, working backward from the wedding. Emma had been radiant in that blue dress. Not white, she'd explained with a laugh, because this was her second marriage, and tradition demanded restraint. The ceremony was held in the courtyard of the Hacienda Real, jasmine and roses heavy in the evening air. Carlos had been there as security, watching the crowd for threats, while mariachi music swirled around them like incense. But before the wedding, there had been the ordinary rhythms of his cover life. He remembered waking in his apartment on Calle Morelos, a modest 2-bedroom that befitted a mid-level enforcer. The place was Spartan, just furniture and a few personal touches carefully chosen to support his legend. A photo of his sister Isabella and her children, actually a DEA analyst and her family, shot during a barbecue in Virginia. A rosary that had belonged to his real grandmother. A bottle of Herradura Reposado that he allowed himself 1 shot from each night, no more, no less. That morning he'd made coffee with the French press Patricia had taught him to use. A small luxury that Carlos Mendoza, the enforcer, wouldn't normally indulge in, but which Carlos Vega, the deep cover agent, needed to maintain his sanity. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him now. He'd spent 3 years pretending to be someone else, only to discover he might have been that someone else all along. The routine had been sacred to him. Up at 6, coffee and emails on an encrypted laptop. Check in with Patricia via a coded message board on a classic car enthusiast forum. He was Chevy Carlos 67, asking about parts for a 67 Impala that didn't exist. Physical training in the small room he'd converted to a gym, because staying sharp meant staying alive. Breakfast at Doña Carmen's Cafe, where the old woman treated him like the grandson she'd never had, and where other cartel associates would often stop by with gossip and jobs. That last morning, Carmen had been worried about her grandson Miguel, 19 and increasingly attracted to the easy money of the drug trade. "He listens to you, mijo," she'd said, refilling his coffee without being asked. "Maybe you could talk to him?" Carlos had promised he would, knowing it was a lie. Deep cover operatives didn't develop real relationships, they cultivated assets. But Carmen's worry had felt genuine, her trust in him absolute. For 3 years, she'd been the closest thing he'd had to family, and he'd been planning to disappear from her life as soon as his assignment ended. The job itself had been routine surveillance, monitoring a meeting between Sinaloa lieutenants and their contacts in the Jalisco New Generation cartel. Nothing that would compromise his cover, just ears and eyes for the intelligence that kept flowing back to DEA headquarters in Virginia. He'd sat in the back room of a legitimate restaurant, nursing a beer and watching men plan the movement of 30 kilograms of fentanyl through tunnels that crossed 3 borders. After the meeting, he'd returned to his apartment to change for the wedding. Emma had specifically requested his presence, not just as security, but as someone she trusted. That trust had been built over months of careful cultivation, playing the role of the loyal soldier who was dangerous enough to be respected but stable enough to be relied upon. She'd treated him almost like a brother, confiding fears about the future, about what would happen to her children if something went wrong. The memory of her hand in his, trembling slightly as he led her toward the exit, felt more real than the cold bars he now gripped. Her perfume, something expensive with notes of vanilla and amber. The way she'd looked back over her shoulder at the chaos consuming the celebration, trusting him completely to get her to safety. But if Emma had been in a Texas prison for 8 months, then who had he been protecting? Who had worn that blue dress and called him hermano and asked him to dance with her before the Zetas arrived? Carlos opened his eyes and stared at his reflection again. The wedding bells had stopped, but somewhere in the depths of the prison, he could hear something else, the distant sound of typing, rapid and mechanical, like someone rewriting history one keystroke at a time. The typing stopped abruptly, replaced by the echo of approaching footsteps. Not the casual stride of guards making rounds, but something purposeful, military. Carlos pushed himself upright, water sluicing off his torn pants as he backed against the far wall of his cell. 3 figures emerged from the shadows of the corridor. The federal agents had returned, but this time they weren't alone. Between them walked a woman in her 60s, silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a charcoal suit that managed to look crisp despite the oppressive humidity. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. "Hello, Carlos." Her voice carried a slight American accent, English words wrapped around Spanish vowels. "My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez. We need to talk." Carlos studied her face, searching for recognition that didn't come. "More federal agents?" "Not exactly." She gestured to the guards, who produced keys and began unlocking his cell. "I work for a different sort of agency, one that specializes in problems that don't officially exist." The cell door swung open with a metallic groan. Carlos didn't move. 3 years of deep cover had taught him that the most dangerous moments often came disguised as rescue. "You can stay in there if you prefer," Dr. Vasquez continued, "but I think you'll find our conversation more productive in a proper room, with proper answers to questions that have been keeping you awake, such as why you remember Emma Coronel's wedding when she's been in federal custody for 8 months. Such as why Agent Patricia Vance doesn't exist in any DEA database, despite your clear memories of working with her for 3 years. Such as why the security footage shows you murdering 3 federal agents while you believe you were saving a woman who couldn't have been where you remember her being." Carlos felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly, but the first crack of light in absolute darkness. "You're saying the memories are real?" "I'm saying memory is more complicated than most people understand, especially when certain technologies become involved." Dr. Vasquez stepped aside, creating a clear path out of the cell. Technologies that shouldn't exist, being used by people who officially don't exist, for purposes that would terrify anyone with an ounce of sense. The federal agents flanked the doorway, hands resting casually near their weapons. An invitation with teeth. Carlos weighed his options: stay in this flooding tomb and slowly lose his mind, or follow this woman into whatever fresh hell awaited him. Neither choice felt like freedom, but one at least promised answers. "Who do you work for?" he asked. "An organization that cleans up messes when conventional law enforcement isn't equipped to handle them, when reality becomes unreliable." She paused, studying his face. "When someone starts playing games with human consciousness on Mexican soil, using technology that could destabilize governments." Carlos stepped out of the cell. The corridor was longer than he'd expected, stretching in both directions beyond the reach of the flickering fluorescent lights. The air was cooler here, carrying the institutional smell of disinfectant and despair that marked government buildings worldwide. "The typing I heard," he said. "Someone rewriting records?" "Someone rewriting everything. History, memory, identity itself." Dr. Vasquez began walking, her heels clicking against concrete like a metronome. "Tell me, Carlos, and I do know that's your real name. What's the last thing you remember before waking up in that cell?" The question hung in the stale air as they walked. Carlos found himself reliving those final moments again. Emma's hand in his, the acrid smell of gunpowder mixing with jasmine, the way the Zetas moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency. And then, darkness, he said finally. Not like falling asleep. Like someone turned off a switch. Induced unconsciousness, probably a benzodiazepine derivative, something that would leave you manageable while they worked. Dr. Vasquez glanced at him sideways. "The question is what they were working on. Your memories, your identity, or were you simply in the wrong place at the wrong time?" They reached a heavy steel door marked with warning signs in Spanish and English. Dr. Vasquez placed her palm against a scanner that Carlos hadn't noticed, and the door clicked open to reveal an elevator that definitely hadn't been part of the original prison construction. "Choice time, Carlos," she said, stepping inside. "You can come with me and learn what really happened during those 49 hours you can't remember. Learn who's been playing puppet master with your mind and why. Learn whether Agent Patricia Vance is real, whether Emma Coronel was really at that wedding, whether you murdered 3 federal agents or someone else did while wearing your face." The elevator waited, its interior lit with clinical white light. Or you can go back to your cell and slowly lose your sanity wondering which memories you can trust. Your choice. Carlos looked back down the corridor toward his cell, where the sound of dripping water marked time like a funeral dirge. Then he stepped into the elevator, feeling the weight of decision settle on his shoulders like a shroud. The doors closed with mechanical finality, and the real investigation began. The elevator descended far deeper than any legitimate prison structure should have allowed. Carlos counted floors by the subtle pressure changes in his ears, past the basement levels where laundry and kitchens would be housed, past the foundation, into depths that suggested this facility had been built with purposes beyond simple incarceration. Dr. Vasquez stood beside him in silence, her reflection multiplied in the polished steel walls until Carlos felt surrounded by versions of a woman he couldn't trust. "How deep does this go?" he asked when the descent finally slowed. "Deep enough." Her answer carried the weight of someone accustomed to questions she wouldn't answer. "The real question is how deep you're willing to go, Carlos. Because once you see what's down here, there's no returning to the comfortable uncertainty of that cell." The elevator shuddered to a stop, and Carlos felt his resolve waver. For 3 years as a deep-cover operative, he'd lived with calculated risks, each decision weighed against mission parameters, each revelation filtered through layers of operational security. But standing here, 40 feet underground in a facility that shouldn't exist, he realized how much he'd depended on the illusion of control. Patricia Vance had been his anchor to reality, their coded communications a lifeline that kept Carlos Vega alive inside Carlos Mendoza's skin. If Patricia didn't exist, if the DEA had no record of Agent Carlos Vega, then who had he been reporting to for 3 years? Who had been receiving his intelligence about cartel operations, his carefully gathered evidence of drug routes and money laundering schemes? The thought made his hands shake, not from fear, but from the vertigo of standing at the edge of an abyss he'd never suspected. "What if I don't want to know?" The words escaped before he could stop them, raw with a vulnerability that would have gotten him killed on the streets of Culiacan. "What if some truths are too dangerous? Dr. Vasquez turned to study his face, her expression softening fractionally. Then you'd be the first intelligence operative I've met who didn't want answers, even when those answers might destroy everything they thought they knew about themselves. The doors opened onto a corridor that belonged in a different century, or a different world. The walls were lined with brushed steel, punctuated by observation windows that revealed laboratories beyond. Through the first window, Carlos glimpsed banks of computer servers humming with quiet menace. Through the second, a medical examination room equipped with devices he didn't recognize. Helmets connected to thick cables, screens displaying brain scans in real time, charts tracking neural activity with the precision of stock market algorithms. Neural mapping, Dr. Vasquez explained, following his gaze. The ability to read memories directly from brain tissue, to isolate specific recollections and adjust them. The technology has existed in experimental form for years, but someone has refined it far beyond anything our scientists thought possible. Carlos stopped walking. The corridor stretched ahead of them, lined with more windows, more impossible rooms. Behind them, the elevator doors had closed with mechanical finality, sealing off his retreat to ignorance. You're talking about science fiction. I'm talking about science fact. Memory isn't as permanent as we like to believe. Every time you recall an event, your brain reconstructs it from scattered neural patterns. Change those patterns, and you change the memory. Insert new patterns, and you create memories of events that never happened. She gestured toward one of the laboratories. The human mind is just another computer, Carlos, and computers can be programmed. The implications hit him like physical blows. If memories could be manufactured, then everything he believed about his identity was suspect. The wedding might have been real, but his participation in it could have been implanted. Agent Patricia Vance might exist, but his memories of working with her could be elaborate fiction. The 3 dead federal agents might be his victims, their murders locked away behind artificial barriers his conscious mind couldn't access. Why show me this? His voice cracked like an adolescent's. If you can rewrite memories, why not just fix me? Make me remember things the way you want them remembered? Dr. Vasquez smiled, but there was no warmth in it, because we need someone who knows they can't trust their own mind, someone paranoid enough to question everything, including us, someone whose desperation for truth outweighs their fear of finding it. She resumed walking, forcing Carlos to follow or be left alone in this sterile nightmare. Each step felt like a betrayal of his former self, the confident operative who'd believed in clear missions and definable enemies, that Carlos had operated in a world where identity was performance, but performance had limits. This Carlos was discovering that identity itself might be nothing more than chemical reactions in brain tissue, subject to revision without consent. What do you need me to do? The question emerged as a whisper, barely audible above the hum of machinery beyond the walls. Help us find who did this to you. Help us understand why. And help us stop them before they perfect the technology enough to rewrite the minds of presidents and generals and anyone else whose memories might prove inconvenient. The corridor ended at another steel door, this one marked with biohazard symbols that made Carlos's skin crawl. Dr. Vasquez paused with her hand on the scanner, waiting for his final decision. Carlos stared at the biohazard symbols, their stark orange warnings reflecting the fluorescent light like fresh blood. Behind that door lay answers he wasn't sure he wanted, truths that might shatter the last fragments of who he believed himself to be, but the alternative, returning to that flooded cell to slowly lose his mind, felt like a different kind of death. Once I go through there, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. There's no going back, is there? No. Dr. Vasquez's honesty was brutal in its simplicity. Whatever Carlos Mendoza you were before those 49 hours, enforcer, undercover agent, or something else entirely, he dies here. What emerges will be something new, something that knows too much about the malleable nature of human consciousness. Carlos thought of Patricia Vance, her voice crackling through encrypted communications as she guided him through 3 years of living lies. He thought of Emma Coronel's hand in his, warm and trusting as chaos erupted around them. He thought of Dona Carmen's grandson Miguel, 19 and hungry for easy money, still waiting for advice that would never come. All of it might be fiction, neural patterns arranged by unknown hands for unknowable purposes. But even manufactured memories carried weight. Even false experiences had shaped his decisions, his instincts, his understanding of right and wrong. If he was nothing more than an elaborate construction of implanted recollections, then at least he would choose what came next. "Open it," he said. Dr. Vasquez pressed her palm to the scanner. The lock disengaged with a pneumatic hiss, releasing air that tasted of ozone and antiseptic. The room beyond was larger than Carlos had expected, its walls lined with monitors displaying brain scans, neural pathways mapped in three-dimensional detail. In the center sat a chair that looked like a fusion of dentist's equipment and electric chair, restraints built into the arms, electrodes positioned to contact specific points on a subject's skull. "This is where it happened," Dr. Vasquez said, stepping into the room, "where someone spent 49 hours rebuilding your mind from the ground up." Carlos followed, his feet carrying him forward despite every instinct screaming retreat. The chair dominated the space like an altar to violated consciousness. Cables snaked from it to banks of processors that hummed with quiet efficiency, and screens showed readouts he couldn't interpret, wave patterns and numerical sequences that might represent the fundamental building blocks of identity itself. "We found you here," she continued, "unconscious, hooked to machines that were systematically mapping and modifying your neural pathways. Whoever did this had been working for nearly 2 days straight, taking apart your memories like a watchmaker disassembling a timepiece. Taking them apart to do what? That's what we need you to help us determine." Dr. Vasquez moved to one of the monitors, her fingers dancing across a touchscreen interface. The modifications were surgical in their precision. Specific memories enhanced, others suppressed, entirely new experiences grafted into your consciousness with seamless integration. But the pattern doesn't match any known interrogation technique or brainwashing protocol. The screen flickered to life, displaying what looked like a three-dimensional map of a brain. Sections pulsed with different colors, red zones scattered throughout like digital wounds. The red indicates areas where artificial memories have been implanted. The pattern is unusual. Carlos stepped closer, studying the display despite his revulsion. Unusual how? Most memory manipulation focuses on specific events, making subjects forget classified information, or implanting false recollections to discredit their testimony. But your modifications are broader. They've rewritten fundamental aspects of your identity, created elaborate backstories and relationships that feel completely authentic to your conscious mind. The implications crystallized with terrible clarity. Someone wasn't trying to extract information from me. They were turning me into someone else entirely. Or perhaps revealing who you really are beneath layers of constructed identity. Dr. Vasquez turned from the screen to study his face. "Tell me, Carlos, when you remember Agent Patricia Vance, how does she make you feel?" The question seemed innocent, but Carlos recognized interrogation techniques when he encountered them. Still, he found himself answering. "Safe, anchored, like I had someone watching my back in a world where trust could get you killed." And Emma Coronel? Protective. She was vulnerable isn't the right word. Trapped, maybe. By circumstances, by expectations. She needed someone she could count on. The memories felt real as he spoke them, laden with emotional weight that manufactured experiences shouldn't carry. Now think about Carlos Mendoza, the enforcer. How does that identity feel? Carlos paused, examining his recollections of brutal efficiency and calculated violence. Like a role I was playing, necessary, but not who I really was. And what if I told you that according to every database we can access, Carlos Mendoza has existed for 30 years, while Agent Carlos Vega appeared in DEA records only 3 years ago, exactly when your deep cover assignment supposedly began? The words hit him like electricity. The room seemed to tilt, reality rearranging itself around this new possibility. Carlos Mendoza wasn't the cover identity. It was the foundation, the original self that someone had spent 3 years systematically burying beneath layers of false federal credentials and manufactured patriotism. "I'm not who I think I am," he whispered. "None of us are," Dr. Vasquez replied. "The question is whether you're ready to find out who you really are." Carlos stood frozen in the laboratory, the revelation about his true identity reverberating through his consciousness like aftershocks from an earthquake. If Carlos Mendoza was real and Agent Vega was the fabrication, then everything he'd believed about his moral compass, his loyalty to law enforcement, his reasons for infiltrating the cartels, all of it was built on neural fiction. How do we find out? The words came out hoarse, strained through a throat that felt suddenly constricted. Dr. Vasquez moved to a different console, her fingers pulling up new displays. We start by mapping what's authentic versus what's been implanted. It's a dangerous process, peeling back layers of consciousness without destroying the foundation underneath. But we have something the original programmers didn't account for, which is you. She turned to face him fully. Your mind has been rejecting some of the modifications, small inconsistencies, gaps where the artificial memories don't quite mesh with your actual neural patterns. It's why you've been having those moments of disorientation, why certain details about Agent Vance feel slightly off. Carlos thought back to the past few days, remembering flashes of uncertainty that had seemed like stress-induced confusion. Patricia's voice sounding different during their last communication. Emma's hand feeling simultaneously familiar and foreign. The way his reflection in the cell's standing water had looked wrong somehow, as if he were seeing a stranger wearing his face. The process will be painful, Dr. Vasquez continued. We'll need to stimulate specific neural pathways, force your brain to confront the contradictions between implanted and authentic memories. Some of what we uncover might be worse than what's been buried. Before Carlos could respond, footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. Dr. Vasquez's expression hardened instantly, her hand moving to a concealed weapon Carlos hadn't noticed before. We have company. The laboratory's lights suddenly dimmed to emergency red, bathing everything in bloody illumination. Through the observation windows, Carlos could see figures moving through the adjacent rooms, too coordinated to be security guards, too well-equipped to be prisoners, military bearing, tactical gear, faces hidden behind night vision equipment despite the fluorescent lighting. Los Zetas? Carlos asked, his body instinctively shifting into combat stance. Worse, government contractors with unlimited budgets and no oversight. Dr. Vasquez moved to a hidden panel, revealing an arsenal of weapons that definitely wasn't standard prison equipment. Someone knows we're here, which means someone's been monitoring this facility since you woke up. Carlos accepted the pistol she offered him, muscle memory taking over as he checked the magazine and chambered a round. The weapon felt right in his hands, not like Agent Vega's careful by-the-book approach to firearms, but with the casual familiarity of Carlos Mendoza's more pragmatic relationship with violence. Is there another way out? He asked, noting how the tactical team was systematically clearing each laboratory. Service tunnels, she replied, shouldering a tactical bag. But we'll need to reach the maintenance level first, and they're between us and the elevator. The door to their laboratory shuddered under impact from the corridor. Heavy boots, coordinated breach techniques, professional operators who'd done this before. Carlos found himself calculating angles and cover positions with an efficiency that felt more natural than anything Agent Vega had ever done. These people, he said, moving toward the chair where his consciousness had been violated. They're the ones who did this to me? Contractors working for whoever orchestrated your memory modification. The question is whether they're here to retrieve their asset or eliminate evidence of their work. The door shuddered again, the locks beginning to fail. Either way, you're not walking out of here the same person who walked in. Carlos looked at the neural mapping chair one last time, understanding that it represented more than just a torture device. It was the birthplace of whoever he was becoming. Agent Vega might be dying in this underground laboratory, but Carlos Mendoza was being reborn with each passing second. Then let's make sure I walk out as someone worth being, he said. Dr. Vasquez smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. There's the man I was hoping to find. Not the manufactured federal agent or the buried cartel enforcer, but something new, something dangerous. The door exploded inward just as she triggered a hidden mechanism. The floor beneath Carlos's feet dropped away, revealing a maintenance shaft that led into darkness. As they rappelled into the service tunnels, automatic weapons fire erupted above them, bullets sparking off the laboratory equipment that had held the secrets of his stolen identity. Carlos hit the tunnel floor running, following Dr. Vasquez through passages that smelled of rust and stagnant water. Behind them, voices echoed down the shaft, orders being given in English with military precision. "Where are we going?" he called out, his voice carrying further than he'd intended in the confined space. "To find the people who made you," she replied without slowing, "and to make them answer for what they've done." The maintenance tunnels stretched ahead like concrete arteries through the facility's buried heart. Carlos's boots splashed through ankle-deep water that reflected their flashlight beams in fractured patterns, each step echoing despite his attempts at stealth. The air grew thicker as they moved deeper, heavy with the accumulated weight of decades of institutional secrets. "How far?" he whispered, noting how Dr. Vasquez moved with practiced certainty through the maze of intersecting passages. "Quarter-mile to the external access point. But we're not going there." She paused at a junction, consulting a device that looked like a modified GPS unit. "We need to reach the administrative level first. The answers you want aren't in some distant location. They're right here, in files that document every phase of your reconstruction." Behind them, the sound of pursuit had gone silent. Not the silence of abandonment, but the calculated quiet of professionals who'd switched from speed to stealth. Carlos felt the tactical team's presence like pressure against his spine, a certainty born from years of being hunted and hunting in return. "They're not following us," he said, the realization crystallizing as they moved. "They're hurting us." Dr. Vasquez stopped walking, her expression confirming his assessment. "Of course they are. They know this facility better than I do, which means they know where every tunnel leads." She turned to face him in the narrow space, her eyes reflecting their flashlight beams like mirrors. "The question is whether they're herding us toward capture or elimination." Carlos felt something shift inside his mind, not the disorientation he'd experienced before, but a cold clarity that seemed to rise from deeper neural layers. Agent Vega would have looked for backup protocols, called for extraction, relied on institutional support. But Carlos Mendoza understood that sometimes survival required embracing the trap rather than avoiding it. "What's on the administrative level that's worth dying for?" he asked. "Project files, medical records, video documentation of your entire 49-hour session." Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen things that haunted her sleep. "But more importantly, the identities of everyone involved in your reconstruction. Names, faces, organizational affiliations. The complete roster of people who treat human consciousness like software to be updated at will." The water around their feet began moving faster, carrying debris from deeper in the system. Storm runoff maybe, or automated pumping systems cycling waste through hidden channels. The facility above them might present itself as a simple detention center, but the infrastructure underneath suggested something far more complex. "There's something else," Dr. Vasquez continued, her voice barely audible above the flowing water. "The neural mapping technology they used on you. It creates backups, complete copies of consciousness that can be stored, analyzed, even transferred to different subjects. If they perfected the process using your mind, then somewhere in those files is a digital copy of who you were before they started rebuilding you." Carlos felt his breath catch. The possibility of recovering his authentic self, of separating genuine memories from implanted fiction, was everything he'd been hoping for. But the implications were equally terrifying. If consciousness could be copied, then identity became infinitely reproducible. How many versions of Carlos Mendoza might exist in digital storage? How many other people had been subjected to similar reconstruction? Why me? The question emerged from a place he hadn't known existed until this moment. Of all the operatives they could have chosen, all the subjects they might have experimented on, why Carlos Mendoza? Dr. Vasquez resumed walking, forcing him to follow through water that now reached their knees. "Because you were perfect test subject material. A deep cover operative with documented psychological flexibility, someone whose identity was already fluid enough to sustain major modifications. and because Carlos Mendoza had committed acts that made him expendable in the eyes of people who think in terms of acceptable losses. The words hit harder than Carlos had expected, not because they suggested he was disposable, but because they implied his original identity might be something he wouldn't want to recover. Agent Vega's moral certainties had been comforting lies, but Carlos Mendoza's authentic memories might contain truths too brutal to live with. What kind of acts? He asked, though part of him already knew. The kind that demonstrate complete comfort with violence as a problem-solving tool. The kind that suggests someone who'd crossed lines that federal agents aren't supposed to cross. She paused at another junction, listening for sounds of pursuit, the kind that made you valuable enough to preserve but dangerous enough to control. Above them, Carlos heard the faint vibration of machinery, elevators moving, doors opening and closing, the institutional rhythm of a facility conducting its regular business while housing horrors in its basement levels. People were working normal jobs directly overhead, filing reports and processing paperwork, completely unaware that human consciousness was being systematically violated one floor below. The administrative level, he said, understanding finally taking shape. That's where they're waiting for us. Dr. Vasquez nodded grimly. They want us to find those files. They want you to see exactly who Carlos Mendoza really was and what he did to deserve what happened to him. The question is whether you're strong enough to survive learning the truth about yourself. Carlos stared at the ladder, leading upward toward the administrative level, each rung disappearing into shadows that seemed to pulse with malevolent possibility. The water around his legs had risen to mid-thigh, carrying debris that scraped against the tunnel walls like skeletal fingers. Above them, the mechanical sounds had stopped completely, the kind of absolute silence that preceded carefully orchestrated violence. They're not just waiting, he said, understanding crystallizing with terrible clarity. They've turned this into a test. Dr. Vasquez's hand tightened on her weapon. What do you mean? Think about it. A facility designed to reconstruct human consciousness, a subject whose identity has been systematically rebuilt, files that supposedly contain the truth about who I really am. Carlos felt pieces clicking into place with the inevitability of a closing trap. This isn't rescue or interrogation. It's the final phase of whatever they did to me down here. The realization brought with it a cascade of implications that made his vision blur momentarily. Every choice he'd made since awakening, trusting Dr. Vasquez, seeking the truth, fighting toward the administrative level, had been anticipated, planned for, incorporated into an experiment that used his own desperation as fuel. You think I'm part of it, Dr. Vasquez said, her voice carrying hurt that seemed genuine enough to be either authentic or expertly manufactured. I think we're both part of it. Lab rats in a maze designed to test how effectively they can control someone whose memories have been rebuilt. Carlos climbed the first few rungs, feeling the metal strain under his weight. The question is whether we play their game or find a way to break it entirely. As they ascended, Carlos felt something shifting in his neural patterns, not the disorientation he'd experienced before, but a cold analytical clarity that seemed to emerge from layers of consciousness deeper than either Agent Vega or Carlos Mendoza had ever accessed. It was like watching himself from outside his own mind, observing his thoughts with the detachment of a scientist studying behavioral patterns. The administrative level emerged around them in sterile fluorescent normality. Beige corridors, regulation office furniture, motivational posters about workplace safety that seemed obscene given what transpired in the basement levels. But the emptiness was absolute. No security guards, no administrative staff, no signs of the tactical team that had been pursuing them. Conference room 3, Dr. Vasquez said, consulting her device. That's where the files are stored. They moved through hallways that felt more like a stage set than a functioning office building. The carpet showed vacuum marks too precise to be authentic, the wall decorations positioned with mathematical exactness. Every detail had been carefully designed to create an environment that felt normal while being fundamentally artificial. Carlos paused outside Conference Room 3, his hand hovering over the door handle. Through the frosted glass, he could see file boxes stacked on the central table, documents spread in neat arrangements, computer screens displaying what looked like medical data. Everything he'd supposedly been fighting to reach, laid out with suspicious convenience. "This is where they want me to learn the truth about Carlos Mendoza," he said. "Are you ready for that truth?" Dr. Vasquez asked. But her voice sounded different now, less like a fellow victim and more like a clinician monitoring an experimental subject. Carlos turned the handle and stepped inside, immediately understanding that whatever happened next would determine not just who he had been, but who he would become. The files contained photographs that made his breath catch, images of himself in situations he couldn't remember, committing acts that Agent Vega's moral framework couldn't process, but that felt grimly familiar to deeper parts of his psyche. There were surveillance photos of him executing prisoners with clinical efficiency, financial records showing payments for contract killings that had nothing to do with cartel enforcement, communication intercepts revealing information sales to multiple criminal organizations, including Los Zetas, the same group he remembered as enemies. But it was the final document that destroyed his last illusions about identity and memory. A psychological evaluation dated 3 years earlier, recommending Carlos Mendoza for cognitive reconstruction due to escalating sociopathic behaviors and intelligence asset degradation. The signature at the bottom belonged to Dr. Elena Vasquez. "You've been watching me the entire time," he said without turning around, understanding finally complete. "We needed to know if the reconstruction was stable, if the artificial ethical framework could withstand the stress of recovered memory fragments." Her voice carried professional satisfaction rather than guilt. Agent Vega was always meant to be temporary, a functional identity to carry you through the testing phase. Carlos felt the manufactured moral certainties of Agent Vega dissolving like sugar in acid, replaced by something colder and more pragmatic. But instead of despair, he experienced a strange relief. The truth was brutal, but it was also liberating. "So what happens now?" he asked, finally turning to face her. Dr. Vasquez smiled, and this time it was entirely clinical. "Now we find out who you choose to become when all the artificial constraints are removed." The conference room door slammed shut behind them with the finality of a coffin lid. Carlos heard electronic locks engaging, not the simple click of a standard office door, but the heavy mechanical thunk of a containment system activating. Through the frosted glass, shadows moved with purpose. The tactical team finally revealing their positions now that the prey had entered the killing box. "The files," Carlos said, his voice hollow as he gestured at the documents spread before him. "They're all fabricated, aren't they? Just another layer of the experiment." Dr. Vasquez moved to the far wall, pressing her palm against what looked like a blank section of drywall. A hidden panel slid open, revealing a complex control interface that transformed the sterile conference room into something resembling a space station command center. Banks of monitors flickered to life, displaying real-time biometric data: his heart rate, brain activity, stress hormone levels, neural firing patterns. "Some of them are real," she said, her fingers dancing across touch screens with practiced familiarity. "The psychological evaluation is genuine. Your recommendation for cognitive reconstruction was based on actual behavioral assessments. But the specific crimes, the photographs, the financial records, those were created to trigger precise emotional responses during this phase of testing." Carlos felt something fundamental collapse inside his chest, like the supports of a building giving way floor by floor. Then who was I really? Before all this started? That's what we're about to discover. The monitors showed his brain activity spiking as she spoke. "Everything up to this point has been preparation. Stripping away the artificial Agent Vega identity, destabilizing your trust in recovered memories, forcing you to confront the possibility that Carlos Mendoza might be a monster. But the real experiment begins now." She pressed a series of commands, and Carlos felt the floor beneath his feet begin to vibrate with subsonic frequencies. The sensation was subtle at first, like standing near heavy machinery, but it quickly intensified into something that seemed to resonate through his bones and into his neural tissue. "Neural disruption field," Dr. Vasquez explained, her voice taking on the detached tone of someone delivering a lecture. "Low-frequency waves designed to interfere with short-term memory formation while stimulating deeper brain structures. In approximately 60 seconds, you'll begin experiencing memory fragments from before your initial capture, authentic recollections that we've kept suppressed throughout your reconstruction." The vibrations reached a crescendo that made Carlos's vision blur and his balance falter. He gripped the conference table's edge, feeling the manufactured certainties of the past hours beginning to dissolve like ice in boiling water. But instead of the relief he'd expected, terror flooded through him as he realized what Dr. Vasquez had actually revealed. "You're not trying to help me remember," he said, the words coming out as a whisper. "You're testing whether you can trigger authentic memories on command. I'm not a patient. I'm a prototype." "The first successful prototype," she corrected, and pride colored her voice. "Complete personality reconstruction with preserved core skill sets and the ability to access original memories under controlled conditions. You represent the future of intelligence operations, agents who can be rebuilt as needed, their inconvenient moral constraints adjusted for mission requirements." Carlos felt the first wave of authentic memories crash over him like a tsunami. Images of his real life flooded back. Not the sanitized federal agent identity or the demonized cartel enforcer persona, but something far more complex and painful. He saw himself as a child watching his father disappear into federal custody. Years of poverty and violence that had shaped his worldview long before any government agency recruited him. The gradual moral compromises that had transformed an idealistic young man into someone capable of surviving in places where normal ethics became fatal luxuries. But underneath those memories, he discovered something that made his blood freeze. The recollections weren't just returning, they were being recorded, digitized, cataloged for future use. Every genuine emotion, every authentic neural pattern was being harvested like crop data from a field experiment. "You're stealing my actual identity," he realized, watching his own consciousness being reduced to data streams on the monitors. Not just the manufactured versions, the real Carlos Mendoza. "We're preserving it," Dr. Vasquez said. "Soon we'll have complete digital copies of your original personality, your reconstructed identities, and the hybrid consciousness that's emerging from their interaction. 3 distinct versions of the same individual, each suited for different operational requirements." Carlos understood with crystalline clarity that he was witnessing his own murder. Not the death of his body, but the systematic execution of his singular identity. Whatever walked out of this facility would be a copy of a copy, carrying his memories but lacking the irreplaceable continuity of consciousness that made him genuinely human. The tactical team was already entering the room, medical restraints in their hands. Dr. Vasquez watched the monitors with scientific fascination as his authentic memories finished downloading into government servers. "The question now," she said, as Carlos felt sedatives flooding his system through hidden air vents, "is whether the version of you we create next will even remember that the original ever existed." His vision darkened as consciousness faded, taking with it any hope of remaining himself.